Welcome everyone! It occurred to me that I hadn't covered a game by Hikaru Nakamura yet, but I'm of course very happy to do that. I like today's game because it has a very instructive sacrifice and then Hikaru just makes it look very easy. Let's jump right in. This was played in the World Cup in 2013. He played against Adhiban. Nakamura had white and opened with d4, knight of 6, c4, g6, and after knight to c3, black could go for a Groenveld with d5 or a King's Indian with bishop to g7, and Adhiban chose the King's Indian, which is of course playable, but after e4 you do clearly see what most top players don't like about the King's Indian. White gets this massive pawn center, so black gets cramped, and white on the other hand has plenty of space for his pieces. It continued d6, preventing e4, e5, knight f3, castles, bishop e2, just standard development. But after e5, Nakamura did play something slightly unusual. Most often white either castles right now or advances the d-pawn to get this big space advantage. And one way of playing for white is to go b4 and later advance with c5. In today's game, however, Nakamura traded on e5 and then traded queens, which isn't bad for white, but of course in this case white doesn't get that big space advantage, and based on the numbers the position is actually kinda drawish now. However, the evaluation isn't all that counts. White is ahead in development and the other advantage is more psychological. By playing this way, black doesn't get the game that he wants. Black doesn't play the King's Indian to get a drawish queenless middle game, but since he did get that, he has to adjust his entire attitude or mentality in a way. And again, Nakamura played a kind of sideline now. He went knight to d5, bishop to g5, pinning the knight to then follow up with knight to d5 is way more common. Since the knight now isn't pinned, black traded, and then started to undermine white's pawns with c6. All very logical. The d-pawn is an asset for white, so white either has to defend the pawn or trade on c6, which would help black develop the knight. Nakamura defends with the bishop, but now black does get to develop his bishop with tempo. And if you'd look at the engine, then it'll claim black has completely equalized. White does still have a small lead in development, and after bishop to g5 and rook to c1 we can all see that. However, this is not a tactical position, so taking some extra time usually isn't a big deal. Probably Nakamura didn't even care about getting an opening advantage. He must have planned to simply outplay his lower rated opponent in an equal position. Adhiban did make the most of it. He now gained more space on the queen side, but now a simple and strong move, king to e2. When we have an endgame, or at the very least a simplified middle game, then we want our king in the center of the board, and white's now also connected his rooks. Black then forced white's bishop back, and again gained space, again attacking the bishop. The bishop is trapped, but white doesn't lose a piece, because d takes e6 counterattacks the black bishop, and after the recapture there is now a square for the bishop on d5, and black's knight is now hanging. Adhiban played the best move. He went knight d4 check. Going knight to b4 attacking the bishop and the pawn isn't good, because after trading on b7 and bishop d2, black cannot even take on a2 because rook a1 wins the knight. And if instead knight to e7, then white again trades, and then white simply controls both open files. Therefore knight d4 check by Adhiban. That knight is too strong to be left alive, so bishop takes, and after the bishop trade and pawn takes d4, Nakamura brought the rook to c5, defending and attacking at the same time. And when black in turn defended his pawn, we have another simple but instructive move by Nakamura, king to d3. Again, unlike in the opening, in the endgame the king is very important. Here the king is already actively placed and it cannot be attacked. But there's another very instructive move coming up. First rook from d to d8 and rook from h to c1. But after bishop to f8 attacking the rook, Nakamura doesn't save the rook. He instead played the knight in the center of the board, And after the exchange sack, white will try to prove that his active king, knight and this great pawn are enough to beat black's rook. Objectively speaking, black isn't really worse now, but in practice it's easy to make a mistake. In fact, Adhiban's next move already isn't accurate. He went rook to d6, which does avoid the knight fork on c6 and it blockades the pawn, but his timing is off. A better way to play would be rook from b to c8 first. Now white doesn't want to take on b5 right away because rook c1 would give black easy counterplay. So knight to c6, also threatening a fork on e7, therefore king to f8. And when white takes on b5 here, now black should go rook to d6 and white is a bit stuck because he doesn't want to move the knight and allow rook to c1. But taking on d4 is also impossible now because rook takes knight and the pawn is pinned. Going back to the game, Adhiban instead played rook to d6 right away, but now the king can simply take the pawn, so white has a knight and a pawn for the rook, and white has this great centralized army. Meanwhile, the black rooks don't have any open files, and the black king isn't doing anything yet. Clearly, white is just better now, and watch how Nakamura increased his advantage. After king to f8, he first starts advancing his kingside pawns, and after king to e8, first of all, it's very clear black is lacking counterplay, but g5 helps completely lock down the kingside pawns, restraining black's pieces some more. And now king to e4 by Nakamura, which anticipates black's next move, f6, and the point is that white can now play rook to c6 anyway. If the king were still on d4, then black would have had the in-between move pawn takes knight with check. Now black doesn't have time for that because the rook is hanging now. Therefore, f5 check instead by Adhiban, and then he brought the second rook over to defend, also targeting the pawn, but now white just trades that off, and after king to c5, unsurprisingly, white is winning. The rook is completely dominated, black only has weak or fixed pawns, and the king is really doing nothing. The king does now come over to defend, but Nakamura just gives the move back to black with a3, almost leaving black in zugzwang. Rook a6 was played, but knight c6 check was very strong. White wants to displace the black king in order to infiltrate with his king or advance the pawn. Now don't go king d7 thinking you'll keep white's king out, because the fork wins the game on the spot. So king to e8, not much of a choice. But then Nakamura marched in with his king, and after king to f7, king to c7, rook a8 and d6, Adhiban resigned. The pawn simply cannot be stopped. If let's say king to e6, then we simply advance the pawn and there's just nothing to stop the pawn from queening. Not your typical King's Indian game, but very instructive. Let's check out a couple of key moments. First of all, this trade variation Nakamura was going for has a drawish reputation. But as I said, playing something your opponent doesn't want to play can be very useful. If you get the game you want and your opponent doesn't, then you already have an advantage. Later on, after more pieces were traded, there was also a very important difference in king activity, which is super important in the endgame. But the star move of the game was this very natural exchange sacrifice by Nakamura, giving white a good knight, an active king and a passed pawn against black's rook. And since both the rooks and the black king remained passive, in the end it was actually quite easy for Nakamura to break through and claim the full point. So that's the first Nakamura game I covered on the channel. I'll definitely take a look at more of his games, but I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, please like the video, it really helps me out. There are many more games in the playlist and more chess is coming up tomorrow, so I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.